Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session in the WorkLifeWebinars series for 2020. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, you're very welcome. And for those of you who've been before, thank you for coming along again. And thank you for joining several of the sessions. Based on some of the signups I've seen for this session, we've got some people who like coming back. So you're very welcome. I hope you're finding this series useful. As we're at the end of this year's series, I'd just like to flag that we're planning for 2021. We might do things slightly differently, but we do still want to offer some webinars, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you're interested in. So feel free to get in touch with your suggestions. I'd love to hear from you. What kinds of topics, what kinds of problems would you like to be included, and just what you'd find particularly useful. Really interested in hearing about that. So as ever, just a little bit of housekeeping about today's session. I'm recording this session, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel shortly. For those of you who attended the last session, a quick apology for the technical issues we had with that. We ended up putting a pre-recorded practice run of the webinar online because the recording file was corrupted. So apologies about that. I have my fingers crossed that today's session will be technical glitch free, and we'll have a good recording to share with you online afterwards. So do revisit the contents once it's uploaded, and you can find the recordings of all of the other sessions on our YouTube channel at worklifepsych.com/YouTube. So today we're talking about psychological safety, and I thought I'd preface this a little bit with why this topic today, why at this time of the year. As I'm sure you can imagine, 2020 has been a difficult year for a lot of people on a lot of fronts. There's been a lot of disruption in the workplace. People have experienced massive upheavals to how they live their lives outside of work. And that's led to increased psychological experiences of stress, anxiety, depression, and everything that goes with that. Now, one of the conversations that's coming up a lot between me and my clients in team development contexts, in one-to-one coaching sessions, is speaking up about what's not working or what's not going so well. A lot of the changes that have been implemented this year have been done pretty quickly, maybe more quickly than usual. They've been done under duress or in a state of emergency, so they always haven't been done really, really well. A lot of people have identified ways in which those changes could have been done better, or about how things can be improved post-implementation, and yet many people don't speak up. And this year really sparked my interest in what prevents us from speaking up when we can see that something could be improved or something's about to go wrong, and what factors need to be in place to help us do that. And that, in a nutshell, is psychological safety, where we feel that it's a safe environment for us to point something out that might be unpopular, might not go down well, but that will be focused on rather than us, rather than me as a person raising an issue, raising a risk, or indeed giving feedback about performance. So it's really relevant. And that's one of the things I want to talk about this afternoon, is drill down and explore with you the different scenarios and the different aspects of the workplace that make psychological safety really relevant and really practical, and take it from being an interesting concept to something that we should bear in mind as we go about our day at work. So let's crack on. Please, at any point, ask questions. We have a Q&A functionality in the webinar. Just drop your questions in there at any point. But as we go through, I will also be asking you some questions. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this topic. So a little bit about me, if you haven't attended before. I'm a workplace psychologist. I spend my time helping individuals, teams, and organizations with topics like well-being in the workplace, productivity, and professional effectiveness. You can find out all about what we do, what the day job is, via the link at the bottom of the screen there, WorkLifePsych.com. And the reference to mypocketpsych.com is the podcast that we put out every 2 weeks on topics like this, all about the psychology of the workplace. And as I said, I found this particular topic really relevant in the work that I'm doing when it comes to how people's well-being and how they're performance have been impacted by this year's changes, specifically the working at home changes, and how voice is really important and what stops us from speaking up. And I know I've been exploring it from my preferred perspective through the lens of acceptance and commitment theory. And there are some other additional practical points that I'd like to cover off today, all about that. And as I say, to turn it from a concept into something really practical that you can use. So we're going to explore the concept to get clear on what it actually means to start with, and explore one thing that sometimes we can find difficult. How is it different to trust? Because when you talk about, oh, speaking up, doesn't that depend on how much you trust the people around you? So it is useful to explore how it's different from that other concept. And then we'll spend most of our time exploring, well, why does it matter? Is it not just a fad, a fashion? Is this not just something that's going to be replaced next year by something else? I'll argue, no, it's not. There's some fundamentals that relate to lots of the other aspects of the workplace in which we're interested. And I want to explore that with you. And then finish the session today by looking at the things that we can do to nurture that. Now, not everyone on the call will be an organizational leader. Not everyone who views this recording will be someone who runs their own organization. And often the narrative when we talk about psychological safety is, what can leaders do to improve it? And that's a really valid perspective to take. But I also want to explore these, how can we nurture it points through the lens of what can anyone do? And if you're part of a team, what is it that you can do to increase levels of psychological safety? What can you role model? What is it you can encourage in some very practical terms? But first of all, I'd like you to think of a time when you yourself had to speak up at work or speak out about something at work. Now, before you did that, before you used your position to make a point, what was it you were weighing up before you said anything? Did you give it thought? Did you explore the pros and cons? Maybe what concerned you, and if you had any negative consequences to speaking up, what were they? And this is really key to understanding this, if we can look at our own experience. So I'd love to hear from you. Drop your thoughts into the Q&A. Let me open the box here so I can see. And then we'll have a look at that. So it doesn't need to be anything terribly serious. Share what you're comfortable sharing, bearing in mind this recording will be going elsewhere. But when did you feel, I need to say something, but I'm not quite sure if I should, or I need to weigh this up against pros and cons? It's not just a factor of saying something as soon as I think of it. So common examples that people think about as you're thinking will include spotting a potential error. They can see something is about to happen, that is a mistake, or when they can see that something could be improved, and so they feel they could give feedback to a colleague, or when they can see that something that's being suggested that's largely agreed with maybe has some faults or some downsides that aren't being paid attention to. So we've got one suggestion there, which is another great example, when I was discriminated against subtly. And that's another example when you yourself feel that you have been treated in a way that you don't necessarily agree with, that you don't feel is fair, or indeed when your values are being challenged. Should I say something? What will happen if I say something about this? What are the pros and cons? And is it easier if I keep quiet? Is it better if I speak up? So what I'd like you to do as we go through this session is to think about how this applies to you and to the context in which you work, the people you work with, the kind of work that you do, contextual factors like organizational culture, like how work is set up. Are people all in the same place at the moment, or is it a distributed team and people are working from home, for example? And have you got differences in there in terms of large differences of seniority? Are people based in very different countries and you've got cultural differences? I need you to think about all of this, because all of that makes a difference when we think about the relevance of psychological safety and what we can do to raise levels. Now, one of the things that will have occurred to you, and I know it did me when I started to think back this year about times when I could have spoken up and when I have spoken up, is what your mind does and the images your mind gives you about what could go wrong. And it can make a very compelling case to just keep stuff to yourself. And it can also fill in the gaps with, well, you don't need to because, or the risk is outweighed by A, B, and C. So coming back to our ACT principles, it's really useful to spot those thoughts for what they are. They're thoughts, and they're not necessarily grounded in fact. And one of the key things we're battling against here in sharing our views, maybe our unpopular views, is the discomfort of being in a minority, the discomfort of being the center of attention, or how people may respond to that, even subtly. We're not talking about outright aggression or anything like that, just the discomfort of being alone potentially in a group. So reach back into your experiences and apply that as we go through some of these concepts. So a really simple way to look at this is that psychological safety fundamentally is a shared belief that the team you're in is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So if you speak up, you take an interpersonal risk, that there won't be a really negative result for you as the person who takes that risk. So what kind of interpersonal risk-taking might this refer to? Can you think of any examples, either your own experience or more generally, how that might manifest? Why might someone need to think twice before they take an interpersonal risk in their team? What constitutes an interpersonal risk? I'll give you a moment to think about that before we fill in some of the blanks. So with this definition, what it's underlining is that this is at a team level, this is a shared belief, and that the interpersonal risk-taking is going to be supported, or at least won't have a negative result for the person. And that can take many forms. Just spotting something popping up in the chat here. Judgment of me or my team. So could you expand on, thank you for that. Could you expand a little bit about that? How does that represent interpersonal risk-taking to you? I suppose the key point here is, why is it a risk and not just communication? Voicing opinions that aren't shared may being perceived negatively. Absolutely. So interpersonal risk-taking could constitute saying something about someone's work, about someone's behavior, about someone's contribution that could be construed as a critique, could be construed as a negative contribution. It could take the form of asking for a pause before action is taken so that we can think again, or we can make something even better. The interpersonal risk-taking is subjective and it's contextual, but it means that you're doing something that could be construed in different ways. And so it's not just the standard interpersonal communication that we're used to in a team, it's you putting yourself out there in whatever way that means, and in a way that other people could see as difficult, as an onerous activity. And so there's a risk there that it's not going to be viewed positively. And so this touches on a few things, because it touches on the quality of the team dynamic, it touches on people's communication skills, and it touches on the nature of the work, which I'll explore a little bit later on, because there's a big difference between looking to make something even better than it is and asking people to focus again on further iterative improvement, and pointing out that people have wasted a huge amount of time and a product is never going to see the light of day because there's inbuilt errors. But this is what I want you to remember as we go through this, that it is at the team level, it's not just one-on-one, and it's that when something is raised, when you're taking that risk, that it's a safe place to do that. So a simple way to think of this is that if someone owns up to an error, or they point out that there could be an error, the focus of the team is on the error, not on the person that made it or on the person that pointed it out. So less blaming and more exploring the error or the risk that's been raised. And that's a big difference, because what we're seeing there is the difference between a learning orientation and a punishment orientation. When we're in a learning environment, where how can we make this better? Where did that come from? How might we prevent it from happening again? And the punishment orientation is, how do we stop you doing that again? And how do we dole out an appropriate punishment for having made the mistake in the first place? And of course, you're already thinking ahead, I'm sure, that if you're in this punishment environment, you're going to be a lot less likely to point out your own mistakes and try and keep them quiet and brush them under the carpet. Of course, that kind of issue can create all kinds of problems in an organizational setting. And you don't have to think of the safety critical environments for that to be an issue, but just the everyday, where quality control could be an issue, or small problems that can snowball over time to become really large issues for an organization, all because people didn't think it was safe to speak up about what they saw or what they did. So I hope this is making sense so far. One thing that's really important to clarify is what psychological safety at the team level is not. So first of all, it's not lowering standards and saying, you know what, it's fine here to make loads of mistakes. Don't worry about the quality of your work. It's absolutely not that. And in fact, the researcher and author Amy Ebenson makes a really good point that, if anything, it's a little bit like taking the brake off and allowing a team to be their very best and accelerate, actually. So it's not about lowering the standards. It's about approaching difficulties and potential risks and issues from a different perspective entirely. And in fact, you could raise standards as long as psychological safety is there. So that the risk taking is not going to be punished. And it's also not an excuse for personal attacks. It's not an excuse to give people both barrels constantly and just express yourself how you want. It needs to be contextually sensitive to the values of the organization, to the operating principles of the team. And it's not about blame storming. It's about exploring. It's about using curiosity to find out how things could be improved or why they ended up the way they were. So less blame people, more explore the environment, explore the context. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting, because it's not the same as trust. It's subtly different. And one way that the differentiation is often made is that trust is between two individuals. So if you ask me to do something and we have mutual trust, you won't worry that I won't do it. You'll trust me to do it. And of course, I may breach that trust, but that's a function of our relationship one-on-one. Psychological safety is a group level experience, and it's what will happen between me and this group when I take this risk. And so, yes, there's a relation there. And if there's an awful lot of trust between individuals in the team, it might enable more open communication, but that's not the same as there being group level psychological safety. And this isn't just let's all be nice and friendly to each other. In fact, if you emphasize niceness, it may dissuade people from speaking up, because their concern is about maintaining a harmony or an equilibrium rather than a focus on improvement and iteration and innovation. And their focus may be on avoiding conflict, where they see performance improvement and discussion of errors as inherently full of conflict, when psychological safety just emphasizes it's safe to speak about those things because that is not conflict. That is emphasizing what we're here to do and doing it even better. So it's not about conflict between individuals, it's about exploring ideas. And so an emphasis on maintaining harmony could stifle psychological safety conceivably. And of course, finally there, it's definitely not issuing feedback without consequences. One of the things that makes psychological safety at the team level really relevant is interdependence, this mutual need for us to be successful. So I cannot be successful by myself in a bubble. We are interdependent in some way. The product of your work informs mine, or each of our parts of our work come together to create something. However it is organized, interdependence is really important. So therefore, in these kinds of environments, I can't just issue kind of drive-by feedback and keep going. This is about feedback about what's going on and then being involved in it. So the consequences might be now it's partly my effort to try and improve things, or not only do I give the feedback, but I offer some suggestions. But it's not about just critiquing all the time. And that's one of the traps a team could fall into, that it's open season on telling people that you don't like each other's work. And so a team leader, management and leadership of the organization are responsible for monitoring this kind of thing and role modeling good exploration of feedback, and moderating that with the helpful offers to improve, to solve, and so forth. So it really is at a team level, and it's not the same as trust. They're the two most important things here. But I always talk about this this topic about it's not lowering standards, because that's normally the first sort of pushback I encounter. If someone's not familiar with this concept and they're thinking about performance and the team's outputs, they don't want to lower standards. And so it's really important that if this is of interest to you, this is a key point to make to your stakeholders. If anything, this will unlock innovation and unlock the contribution that people can make to increase performance. As I said, just shout out if you've got questions as we're going along, if any of this isn't making sense, or you've got some examples of your own that you'd like to share with the group. So Amy Edmondson, and I referenced her a couple of times. Now this year I read her book. I'm just going to look over. The Fearless Organization. I've got it mentioned at the very end of this. She's neatly put together some nice case studies and summarizing some of the research in this space. But the Fearless Organization, and her talks about it, shares some really good examples of the applicability of this and why it's important, and how organizations have made changes on the back of this. And I'm sure you're all wondering what that image represents. So I just wanted to relay very quickly one of the stories she shares about a nurse about to administer medication to a patient, and then has second thoughts that I'm not quite sure this is correct, and then weighs up in her mind the activity of ringing the prescribing doctor to double check, and then wonders about how will that be received, and might they think I don't think they can do their job well? Might they, how will they speak to me for questioning their judgment? And isn't this what they're paid to do? And aren't they better than me? And then ignores it and proceeds with the instruction while having the doubt. Shares the example of a co-pilot wondering, has a pilot just made an error? And then weighing up the consequences of pointing that out. Now, in both of these examples, you could really see the individual with the higher organizational power, the higher organizational status, could really use that to their advantage to stifle conversation and maybe not respond well to that question about their competence and about what they've actually done. And that's going to be a well-known risk for an individual speaking upwards in the organization. We all know the hierarchy. What will happen if I speak up against that hierarchy? Some senior members of an organization may respond really well to that kind of feedback. Many will not. And the third situation, non-safety critical, because the first two are, the consequences are huge in the immediate short term. The other example she shares is the new hire at board level, who can see that there's a risk associated with an acquisition plan that the board are discussing. They're all behind it. And this new fresh face is wondering, I'm not sure. And of course, then it's about, I'm a minority, I'm new around the table. Is it really the first thing I want to do with impact here? Point out that they've maybe collectively made a mistake. There's more of them than me. I'm sure they've thought it through. And of course, the dangers of that kind of decision making could only rear their head months and months down the line when the organizational weakness was made apparent. Now, there's lots and lots of more mundane, day-to-day examples of how a lack of perceived psychological safety and a lack of voice will contribute to performance issues. And they may manifest immediately in the room, or they may take a long time, and it's when a product comes to market. But either or, they have that in common. Second guessing yourself. Should I speak up? And having seen it not being done well before, as in they pointed it out and they got into trouble for it. I want to learn from their experience. Let me pause at this point, having shared those very short vignettes. Are there any questions about any of this so far? Anything you want to sense check before we move on? I would recommend the book, by the way. It's a very interesting read, really accessible, The Fearless Organization. There's a lot of case study content in there, and that's not always, the most compelling, but it does make for an interesting read. I'll push on and I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box as we go. So let's talk a little bit about this in more detail. And I'd like you to think about your own experience here, your own environment. You don't have to name it, obviously, but we talked about some examples there, some of the things that might prevent someone from speaking up when they see a risk, an issue, an error, whatever it might be. What do you think is going to stop someone from speaking up at work? What are the things that occur to you, or you have experienced, or others have told you? I'd love to see what you have to think about this. I'll share my view with you, obviously, but I'd love to hear from you first. So we had a question in there. If an individual or team makes the same error over and over, would the focus still lay on the error? That's a really good question, because I think there are limits to this. So let's imagine that an error still occurs, even though there has been feedback, even though another way has been identified. Then I think we're talking less about psychological safety, and now we're talking about a performance and skill issue, or we're talking about a communication issue, so that they have clarity on what needs to be done differently. So it's a really good question, because we're not talking about a bottomless pit of let's just keep looking at the error. There may come a point at which we know what needs to be done differently, and now we're talking about performance, but it's not our first port of call. I hope that answers the question. It's a really good one, because we're not talking about limitless patience, I suppose is one way of putting that. So any thoughts on what it is that would stop you from speaking up and covering any of these topics? Maybe telling your boss they might have got it wrong. What's going through your mind? Let me share you some of the things that research tells us will prevent that. First of all, really strong drive in all of us to avoid discomfort. To be the only person in the room speaking up in the opposite direction, or to experience some power distance tension when it is a seniority difference. That's a really powerful drive, and we're kind of wired to avoid discomfort. And if you've come to any of these sessions before, you'll know that it's a really big element of what I do with individuals and teams to help them navigate discomfort in a more sustainable way. But we can also, a subset of that maybe is to have concerns about our reputation. Do we want to be known as the person who points out errors all the time? Isn't it more comfortable to be part of the group that is in agreement? And so we are part of a collective when we're in a team and in an organization. We don't want to necessarily be an outlier. And that may be something that we have to think about, and we weigh that up. And of course, we may say, if this has an impact on what we have to do, maybe working hours, maybe scrapping something, maybe someone will have to put in additional effort as a result of this. Am I then letting the team down, or am I rocking the boat? Am I upsetting things? And am I secure enough in my perspective that I think it outweighs that impact on the team or on our harmony? And of course, people may well spot an issue, a risk, or an error, and then say, it's not my job to point this out. I don't get paid enough to do this. I'm not senior enough to do this, or it's on that part of the team and that's nothing to do with me. It doesn't affect me directly. And of course, then we're thinking about harmony within the team and understanding of mission and purpose, and also interdependence. And it may be that someone has seen, as I mentioned, someone get treated pretty shoddily for raising a risk or an issue or an error in the past. And they learn from that and say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want that to be me. Maybe the culture is one of punishment rather than learning. Maybe they're a politically astute individual and they pay attention to who they can point these things out to and who it may be politically insensitive to do. And this is another factor that we need to bear in mind. And so both at the team level and the organizational level, we become pretty clued in on what gets rewarded here, what gets punished here, what is supported here, what is stamped out here. And of course, if there's increased power distance as a function of the national culture, wherever someone's based geographically, it also might be going completely against form to speak up to a more senior member of the team or the organization to point out a mistake could be or has been made. So I'm kind of painting a picture here that there's an awful lot between us and psychological safety, but there is only if we do nothing about this, if we don't acknowledge these things, and as team leaders and organizational leaders do what needs to be done to nurture that. Now, this is in no way a complete list of the things that could come between it, because what I'm not talking about here at all, for example, is willing sabotage and wanting something to go wrong for somebody else. But these are all the sort of common middle of the road things that might go through our minds when we think, am I the only person who's seen this? Or if I've made a mistake, should I really speak up about it? So why does it matter? And again, I really want to get beneath the skin of this and not just say it's good, there should be more of it, which is kind of self-defeating. But some of the things that the research has pointed to is that it allows us to talk about risks and issues far earlier and do something about them. And that could be the difference between success and failure for a project, or indeed for an entire organization. And of course, for the health and well-being of the people involved in the process or using the product or however it might be. So it can be a time-saving benefit. It contributes to debate. So you move away from, as I said, this seniority equals right tension. And even if it's among peers, people feel empowered to give their view, knowing that it's the view that will be explored, not the person. So decoupling the two, you could say, this person I don't like has come up with a great idea, and I can see the idea for what it is, rather than saying no because of who the person is. It could be because it's their first week in the organization, and I may say, well, they don't know anything, they're not from here. But actually, if we can decouple those things, I can see the idea, the suggestion, as being worthy of exploration. And if we manage to create this environment, we'll be more open to learning from failure. And one of the things that we can all be guilty of from time to time when something goes wrong at work is really work hard to sprint away from that experience. We want to put it behind us as quickly as we can and do something that represents a success, or at least move away from that experience of failure. And that's if we associate failure with a reflection on us as a person, and if we associate it with a collective punishment. And so if we're able to learn from failure, then we're less fearful of failure, and we see it as multiple failures on the way to an eventual success. And of course, that will only happen if we're able to explore what went wrong, what were the root causes, how did we miss this, what might have been the contributory factors, and discuss it rather than say, whose fault is this? Right, we move them, get rid of them, punish them, whatever it is. What's very interesting about discussions about psychological safety is that the opposite, when there's psychological fear, if you like, there's an assumption that things can be improved by moving people about and assuming that the system in which they operate isn't part of the problem. And of course, it frequently can be contributing to errors and issues. People play a role for sure, but if the environment is not one where these things are rewarded or supported, then moving people around or getting rid of people is going to make very, very little difference. And one of the big things that we find consistently is increased personal initiative. That's, taking the initiative, even when it's not my job, speaking up and pointing things out, and also the innovation that comes from this, the thinking more broadly. So not just, as we'll see in a moment when I talk about it, not just let's complete the task, but let's imagine what could be done. And there you get more innovation. coming from this. But I think what's really powerful is the initiative that's shown, moving from, well, that's nothing to do with me, towards, oh, I've just spotted this, and I know that it's important to us to talk about these things, and so I'll take the initiative and have that conversation. I've just seen another question come in. Can psychological safety exist without buy-in at senior leadership level? So that's a really good question. I think senior leadership play a huge role in cultivating it within the organization. But at the same time, it could exist within a team, even if senior leadership aren't that bought into it. But the team leader, who at whatever level that is, needs to be very supportive of making changes within the team. The ideal here, of course, is that all of these kinds of things start at the top, and that behaviors at the top and attitudes at the top are in line with what they express and what they say should be done and thought. So the values, the mission statement, the leadership behaviors, all of that stuff. If that's all congruent, that's great. My experience would be that senior leadership sometimes need convincing that this is something worth cultivating, because frequently the emphasis on a performance/punishment culture where things are right and wrong versus a learning culture where things can continually improve in one direction. It's not a yes/no answer, I'm afraid. They rarely are, but it's important to consider how they could be convinced if they weren't bought in at the very top, and what it might take to convince those stakeholders, given what it is that they do. Just think of two very different environments, a creative environment versus a safety critical environment where, you know, mistakes might cost lives versus mistakes might be unpopular. So we really need to consider the context. I hope that contributes to an answer for you at least. So what I'd like to do is then look at these topics and get your views on how you think increasing psychological safety could be relevant and improve these elements that we frequently look at when we talk about our experience of the workplace. So what about health and safety? We've kind of hinted at this so far, but how might improving psychological safety have a knock-on positive effect when it comes to organizational health and safety? Any thoughts on that? It's one of the ironies in environments where safety is of prime concern that people may be tempted to hide potential safety breaches or actual safety breaches for fear of punishment. And what we want to do is understand how that could have happened, not who is to blame and can we get rid of them. So one of the things we would hope to see there, through that lens of health and safety, is people speaking up sooner and to the right people about something that they see as being a risk. And of course, we know from research, it's one of the most useful things to explore near misses. It's really useful to have a after event review when an accident happened, but it's really useful to explore when an accident almost happened, and exploring a near miss and what the contributory factors were. So that's how we would expect to see it manifest in the world of health and safety at work. But what about productivity? Thinking at the team level, if we improve psychological safety and people feel that it's a safe place for interpersonal risk taking, how might that relate to productivity? You can interpret that any way you like. Maybe it's doing more stuff, maybe it's doing better stuff. Well, one of the key resources that we work with when it comes to productivity is time. And we want to avoid wasting time in any way to be as efficient as possible. We could argue that there's a point just come through there in the chat, increases courage to do things differently. Absolutely, we may identify ways as a team to be more efficient, and that could contribute to our productivity. A very simple example that many people may have encountered in the shared office space is if a colleague sees you doing something on your monitor, you're working away, and they spot and they say, "Oh, I noticed you're doing that. Did you know that you could do this instead?" And they share some keyboard shortcuts, or they tell you about a menu item you can go to, and you realize, "Oh, that saves me tons of time. Thank you so much." Now, that could have been an example of psychological safety in action. If they were unsure as to how you would respond, if they had great interpersonal trust, that's one thing. But if they didn't know you very well, and they thought, well, I don't know if they'll respond well if I give them this. Maybe they do know what they're doing and they're deciding to work in a less than efficient way. But it can be at that level. It can be at that really day-to-day level. What about workplace well-being? So not necessarily health and safety breaches, but people thriving, people not being made ill, stress, workplace well-being. What do we think there? How might an increase in psychological safety contribute to that? Well, one of the things that I've been exploring recently with clients has been about the role of relationships and stress, and doing some work with some teams where interpersonal relationships have contributed to people's experience of stress in the workplace. So if we can move to a learning orientation and a move away from potential conflict of ideas to exploring ideas and improvements, we could have a knock-on effect there. An organization's reputation could be improved through quality improvements, but where people talk about what it's like to work there, and where it's about constant improvement, and it's about the ideas being debated. That can be really, really positive. And of course, with all the working from home that's going on at the moment, it's really important that we remember that speaking up is potentially more difficult when we are removed from the physical space that we're used to working in with our colleagues. So important to remember that we need to cultivate this psychological safety to enable people to speak up remotely and point out things that might be easier when they're face to face in the same space. And from a talent management perspective, really important. One of the ideas I had the other week when discussing this with someone was psychological safety around speaking up when you see a risk regarding a new hire at a senior level. You've got your doubts and you want to dig a bit deeper, or have another interview, or explore some of their skills in more detail. And of course, they may be presenting as a bit of a superstar and everyone wants to hire them, and you have doubts. That's where psychological safety is really, really relevant. Speaking up at that point and not just assuming, I'm sure everything will work out. This is a model that's used just to put our minds at rest about, in a sense, performance standards, or looking for high performance. And this learning orientation I've discussed is our top right corner here, where you manage to cultivate high psychological safety and you can combine that with performance standards. You get this learning. You remove the brake, you press the accelerator, you get a learning orientation, and you see all those improvements. But if you emphasize on improvement, and you don't have the capability for people to speak and take those interpersonal risks, you're going to create an environment of anxiety. And of course, if the standards aren't there, why should people care? So you've got apathy. And if there's lower standards and high psychological safety, there's a comfort there, which is pleasant, but it's not around performance and it's not driving things forward. So this is a useful way of exploring this with stakeholders who might see that psychological safety is running contrary to high performance. They go hand in hand, and they speak to continual learning, continual improvement. So some of the key things to remember, and then we'll wrap up, and I'll take any questions if you would like at that point. But one of the key points that I've really found valuable to use with my clients is this point about frame the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. So rather than let's focus on the finishing of this, it's let's explore it and see what we can learn while we're doing it. And maybe through doing that, we'll identify a better way of getting where we want to be, not just following what we said we would do. that can open minds, they can open perspectives to exploring different ways of doing things. And of course, if people know why we're doing it and what's at stake, if you can clarify the purpose, then you may get less of that, it's not my job, or I'm sure it doesn't matter if I don't point this out. If people are bought in as to why we're doing what we're doing. Now, as a team leader, as an organizational leader, it's useful to be humble, to demonstrate what you don't know. And what you're doing there is to say, I don't know everything about this, and so I really welcome your inputs, rather than leaving people with the assumption that because you're leading, you're also a technical expert with a ton of industry knowledge who isn't open to any feedback or has thought of everything up till now. And a distinction I've made several times in our sessions before this year has been the distinction between curiosity and judgment. Curiosity broadly leaves the door open, and it's about, I wonder why. Judgment is, I've decided why. Curiosity is exploring the origins of something, and judgment is effectively closing the door and deciding. And so we want to, when leading a team or leading a group, always be exploring, always asking why. Now, if you really want to live this and you say, I'm open to this and I lead this team and I really want people to speak up, well, then you absolutely need to appreciate the contributions that come your way and acknowledge them and explore them. And that could be difficult and that can be uncomfortable, particularly if you see them as not being particularly useful, but it's about the culture you're contributing here, and it's the process that's really, really important. You're signaling, I am welcoming of these contributions. And then as a really important point, an overarching point here, working hard to destigmatize failure and explore where things came from and to identify improvements. The opposite of labeling individuals as failures, but exploring and ensuring there is time to post-implementation reviews and moving away from that didn't work quickly, let's move on to the next thing, but exploring failure as being one of the things that is inevitable when we do complex, interdependent, ambiguous work. So that's everything I wanted to share with you during this very brief introduction to this topic. But I would recommend Amy Edmondson's book there. And if you don't want to dive straight into the book, she's very prolific in terms of giving interviews about her work. So you can find a lot of her ideas out there on YouTube if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Come back to the recording if there's anything that interests you in particular. That's one of the joys of having a recording. You can revisit it as much as you would like. And with an eye on 2021, I would love to hear from you in terms of what you'd like to see more of or less of in our plans for the year ahead. But before I press go, has anyone got any final questions or points they'd like to make? Well, thanks for the feedback. It's always nice to hear from people. So based on that, we will do some more. No, I'm just kidding. If this has been your first one, I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. Do go to the YouTube channel to see if there's any other topics that interest you. And if there's something that you're particularly interested in and it's not been covered there at all, message me. And if it's something I think one of us can talk about competently, we'll pull something together. And even if one of the topics has been covered and you've got a specific angle you're interested in, or even just some follow-up questions, we'd love to hear from you. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And as this is the end of our session, I wish everyone a great holiday over Christmas and all the best for 2021.